do want to talk about some of the aspects that we have as a family that's in the pattern of Jesus, living out the way of Jesus. And on maybe a happier note, I remember when I was a kid, and one of the things that my family used to enjoy doing is we would have family nights every single week, and part of our family night was renting a movie. And we would rent movies. We couldn't stream them at the time. So some of you don't know, some of you aren't aware. In order to watch a movie that you didn't own, you either had to find somebody who owned the movie, okay, or you had to go to a store, a physical location, hope that it was available, and then rent it. And then you got it for a limited amount of days. And so if you wanted to watch this movie more than once, you had about 3 days to do so. So you just keep that thing on repeat. I loved the movies where there was kind of a hero. If he had a sword, that was the best. Ninjas were also one of my favorite things in a movie. And if I would watch one of those movies, the byproduct of this is I would be acting it out for the days to come. My parents had a lot of broken broom handles because I turned into a ninja following the movies. The poles and the trees in our yard suffered casualty as well as they became the enemies upon which I was inflicting my ninja skills. I love getting caught up in the story. And now as I'm raising kids, I love watching them get caught up in the story. They love the action and the adventure. That's what they're drawn to as well. And, it's fun to watch them in their different ways and their different personalities kind of entering into the story. As I'm thinking about this, as I'm watching it, there's something that does capture my attention that I think is a bit universal, and that's, at some level, all of us love being captured into a greater purpose and an adventure. We all have some sense of wanting some kind of purpose and deeper meaning, and we want to be caught up in an adventure. And that adventure might look different based on your personality and what you like, but all of us at some level we're drawn, we have a longing, a deeper understanding that there is more than just the everyday stuff that we see. Now, maybe it's in the area of entertainment that shows us this, just as we've been talking in the film industry. Fantasy and sci-fi, especially the adventure sort of genre, that stuff has been at the top of the box office earnings for years, if not decades. There's always some level of adventure that we want to be drawn into. But maybe it's even beyond that. We can see it on a deeper level in our culture. Over the last several years, there's been a different phenomenon in our culture that we've watched happen. And that is for generations before, many of maybe even you, or at the very least your parents, they found jobs and places in the marketplace that were good sources of income and that were stable. That was kind of one of the main priorities. Is it a good, stable income? Is there something that can just be had for a long period of time? Especially my grandparents' generation, they found a job in which they would start, and it was one career, and they would often retire from it, maybe 2 different jobs. But that was the place they retired, and that's really changed in the last few years. It's changed not because people don't want stability, not because people don't want a good income and a reliable income. It's changed because what we've seen is that people want more than those things. People want and are seeking positions that aren't just good sources of income. That's somewhat becomes the secondary thing. There's been a huge movement of people looking for jobs because there's a greater purpose behind it. There's a greater sense of mission. There's a greater sense of adventure behind it. They want to gather with a group of people that are becoming something more than they could be on their own. It's an interesting thing to watch, but it communicates to that deeper sense, that deeper need that all of us want to be caught up in a greater story than oftentimes life has for us, or oftentimes what we've experienced on our own. So the question is, how do we fulfill, how do we scratch that itch, how do we fulfill the need, how do we enter into a greater understanding and a greater adventure than maybe what we're experiencing today? I want to ask you to turn with me, if you have a Bible, to Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. It's going to be up on the screen above me. Now, Matthew chapter 5, it's an interesting section. It kicks off this whole passage, one of Jesus' most famous teachings he's ever given, called the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to be picking up in verse 14, and just read verses 14 through 16. As Jesus is teaching, he says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Now, purpose, adventure, these are things that have many different aspects. And this morning, we're going to be diving into just one simple aspect. And I just want to be upfront. I believe that the greatest purpose and meaning we can find in life is co-opted, it's caught up in the purpose of God in the world. I don't think there's any other greater adventure that can be had than the one that God has for you. And there's an aspect of this that we're going to see is not just about us. It's not just about me. It's not just about you. And it starts off with what Jesus says. You are the light of the world. Now let's slow down for a second, because I think it's easy for us to understand or to assume that this is a very individual thing. I am the light of the world. No, that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is actually speaking to a very large group of individuals that have come to hear him teach. Primarily, there's what are known as his disciples, his closest followers that are at the very least 12, oftentimes many, many more, made up of men and women. But then beyond that, there's a larger group that has traveled to hear or see Jesus do different things. This has kind of become a very regular thing for Jesus, that whenever he pauses to minister or to help somebody, whenever he pauses to teach, large crowds gather, sometimes so many that they can't even meet in a home. Last week we just heard about a smaller gathering that was around a home, and people couldn't even get to Jesus because there were so many. This is one of those examples where they couldn't even meet in a town or a city because so many people had gathered. And there's various levels of people at this point that we would consider who are following Jesus. Again, we have the closest number, that would be at the minimum 12, that are Jesus' disciples. These are people that have left everything to quite literally follow Jesus wherever he goes. And then maybe on the outskirts, on the edges of this larger gathering of people, we have those who have seen Jesus do something somewhere, and they'd like to see it again. It would include people who even have heard Jesus teach before, and they really like the teachings of Jesus. They're not following him around and trying to mimic him yet, but it's much like we might follow somebody on social media. We really like the content they're producing. So there's going to be people in this crowd that like the content Jesus is producing. In that sense, they are following Jesus. And Jesus looks at all of these people who are at one level or another following him, and he calls them you. It's a collective you. Now, the New Testament, it wasn't written in English, but the original language speaks of this communal collective you. Jesus is speaking to the entire crowd, not to an individual, not to just the 12 in front of him, not to the 72 that were the next level out of that, not even to the 5,000 individuals. It's a collective you. You, all who would claim to be followers of Jesus at some level or another, Jesus calls them light. He says, you, together, are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. Now, this assumes a couple of things. First, it assumes that we understand what the purpose of a light is, and if not, Jesus will get there in a second. The other part of the assumption is that Jesus is now assuming that they understand this metaphor, that we understand this metaphor of light. Light was a significant metaphor in Jesus' time. Light represented all that is good and noble and right in the world. Sometimes it was applied to a person, just as darkness represented the opposite and could sometimes be extended to an individual, but for the most part, light and dark were qualities, especially spiritual qualities in the world. Darkness was everything that's wrong in the world, and light was everything that's right in the world. Now, Jesus comes on the scene, and he says, I am the light of the world. You can read it in other accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible. We have 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible, and this is just one that we're reading out of. In another one, it starts out in the first couple of chapters really giving a lot of weight to the light of the world, that being Jesus, that Jesus has come into a very dark place. Now Jesus looks at the people who are following him, the people who have very likely at some level or another heard him talk about himself as light, and on another level understand this metaphor of light and dark, and he says, you are the light of the world. Maybe for the people on the fringes of the crowd, they're thinking, okay, I see what you did there. That's pretty good. That's pretty good twisting of what we understand. And on the front end, the closer you get into Jesus' inner circle, the more significance this has because they've seen Jesus do a lot. They've seen Jesus be the light in the world. They've seen Jesus be the light in the darkness, and now Jesus looks at them and he says, you together are the light of the world. For those who know Jesus best, they know that this is a call to something more. They know that this is not just a description of how they are, but a calling to who they could be together. Not to one champion or one hero among them, but a collective you. You are the light of the world. As he continues on, Jesus starts with another metaphor beyond light. He says, a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, your translation might say city. It's the same word. It's just giving us a different understanding of what's been translated. In Jesus' time, cities weren't as big as we oftentimes think of them. In fact, a city, for them, a very large city, might have been smaller than the town we live in, which we consider pretty small. For them, that would have been a pretty big city. So sometimes our Bible translates it as town. The bottom line is, regardless, there's a collection of dwellings. Jesus says you're not just a light in the world, but you're more like a city or a town that's built on a hill. Now, I love driving back into Yakima in the dark. I love coming out of the hills, and when you kind of come over the edge of the hill and you can kind of look in, especially from the east or west side of town, and you can see everything laid out in front of you, and it's dark. Everything just glows. You kind of lose some of the roads. You kind of lose some of the individual neighborhoods, and everything's just this collective glow together. And it looks beautiful. Now, on the other hand, you can't see the stars quite as well. But there's this understanding that it looks so much bigger when it's all lit up like that. And it puts in me, it gives me this kind of feeling of hope, this kind of feeling of beauty. It's one of the reasons, actually, that I really like Christmas is all the lights. Right? There's just this collective glow that produces something different in me than when it does in the daytime. Jesus is kind of talking about that kind of a collective glow, but even more so. Because as we look at our own towns and our own structures, there's a significant difference. When we're driving down the highway, there's usually, at least when you're closer to civilization, there's going to be some lamp posts along the way, or there's going to be some light along the way, or you're driving in a vehicle that could light up the way for you. But in Jesus' time, things were very much different. There weren't paved roads in the same way. Rome was really developing, but in many of the cities that Jesus was in the towns that he was in, the paths were very dirt. They were very dirty. And they were long, and sometimes you had to travel a very long distance to get to another location. And your choice was you could ride an animal or you could walk, and most people had to walk. And there were no cars to light the way, there were no street lights, there was no light pollution that was helping them understand where they're going. There's just a dirty path that's very long to get to the next location. It was very dangerous to wander alone as well. It was a very dangerous time to wander alone because there were thieves along the road. And the thieves wouldn't just hold you up at gunpoint or with a weapon. They would beat you, they would jump you, and take everything that you had, oftentimes leaving people for dead. So people very rarely traveled alone because it was incredibly dangerous. On top of the danger of other people, there were dangers of wild animals. There were no fences, there was no sound of traffic to keep them away. And you were an easy target along the road, and beyond that, the path was long. By the time you got to where you were going, you were incredibly tired and hungry and thirsty, and you were ready for rest and refreshment. You were ready to feel safe again. Now, Jesus is speaking to people who understood this. They would understand that as you're on this long journey that's filled with all of these things, there's a moment in the darkness when you start to approach a city and the horizon starts to shift a little and you see the glow. And then because this town or the city is elevated on a hill, it becomes even more prominent. And you don't see the individual lights anymore, but you see this collective glow. And that collective glow means something. The collective glow means a place of rest. It means a place of hospitality. It means a place of refreshment. It means a place of safety. It means that the hard journey is behind. It was a hopeful sight. And Jesus looks at everybody who would follow him, everybody who would live out the teachings that he's been giving them, and he says, that's you. He looks at his people, he says, collectively, that's you. When you live out my teachings, you are like that hopeful, refreshing city on a hill. It's elevated for all to see. It's prominent because it gives hope. In the midst of the dangers and the darkness and everything else that you could experience on the journey to the city is a refreshing sight. As he continues on, he continues to draw out not just a metaphor of who they would be, but now Jesus kind of zooms in on the purpose of light. In verse 15 we read, "Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl." Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Now, I think when Jesus says this, there's probably kind of this like spreading chuckle along the crowd because it seems a little bit ridiculous. Who would light a lamp, right, in the middle of the dark just to cover it up? We understand what the purpose of light is. The purpose of light is so that we can see. The purpose of light is so that it can shine. It kills the purpose of light to cover it up, doesn't it? Not only that, but when you take a hard bowl, when you take a solid bowl and you put it over a flame, it kills the flame, doesn't it? You see, there's something about the nature of light. There's something about the purpose of light that is completely defeated by keeping it hidden. What Jesus is saying is light, the light of his people that follow his teachings, there's a purpose there. There's a greater understanding about who we are. There's a greater understanding about who God is and what he brings and calls us into when we are his people. First, it's a collective group. Secondly, it has purpose, it has meaning. There's a role to be played, and it's to the benefit of other people. In fact, that's what Jesus says. He says we don't hide that light. Instead, we put it on its stand. It's meant to be elevated. It's meant to be seen. Just like that city that's raised up on a hill, the purpose of light is to be elevated so that it is a benefit to everybody else in the house. It gives light to everyone in the house. Now, this is where I think we need to slow down for just a moment because I think it's easy for us to consider maybe some of our experiences that we've had with other Christians, maybe the experiences that we've had with the church. And we might even be at some level thinking, now that's just like somebody at a church to say that they're the ones with the light and nobody else has it. But what I don't want you to hear is this. Jesus didn't say that people are dark. He said they're in the dark. And there's a difference. Right? Jesus isn't making a claim that somebody is producing darkness. He is making a claim that everyone is in darkness and there needs to be light brought into it. And we might argue with some experience that we've had or some kind of baggage that we had or a mistake that somebody's made, maybe even a purposeful bad decision against us. But what we won't argue with is the fact that when a 3-year-old has brain injury, that's not a bad thing. Nobody's going to argue with that. In fact, we might even say that's pretty dark. Nobody would look at some of the circumstances that you've experienced in your life and not claim that there's some level of darkness in the world around us. There's many of us, myself included, who have struggled with moments at the very least of depression. And I tell you what, in those moments, it feels like you're sitting in a room grasping for a light and there's no light to be had. And you wish somebody would come and turn on the light. That's what Jesus is talking about. We don't argue with that. We can't argue with that. we'd have to deny most of the experiences that we've had. There are definite moments where all of us have felt like we're in the dark. And Jesus' claim is he's a light. And if you spend enough time with the light, you'll become like a light to others as well. More than that just being what happens when you're with Jesus, it's the purpose and call of those who are with Jesus. You're not just called to be in his light, you are called to then carry that light to others. Because there are people who are scrambling around and they're searching for the light switch and they can't. Nobody wants to be in the dark. And we sense it when we feel like we have to hide. Do you know what hiding your actions does? You might feel like I get to live however I want. That's fine, but then there's something you're not telling other people, and there's a reason. There's times I've hid myself from others. There's plenty of times I've hid myself from others. And if I get to be who I want, when I want, then why am I hiding that? You see, there's a general sense that even I will keep myself in the dark sometimes. And I will keep myself in the dark because I want to keep you in the dark about who I really am. We know darkness. What we don't like is acknowledging it. We know darkness. We don't like calling it out or understanding that sometimes we all sit in the dark. And Jesus says the purpose of those who are in the light is to be a light for others, not let them just sit in the dark. This is a blessing. This is a helpful thing to others. It's not a condemnation. It's not a reminder that people are in the dark. It's not about telling people, hey, you're in the dark. It's just instead carrying the light into the darkness. There's a very real difference. There's a putting something on display. Jesus talks about the light. You don't put a bowl over it. Instead, you raise it up on a stand. Why? Because you believe people like light better than darkness. One of my favorite things, actually, when I was young, is when our power would go out in the house and my parents would light candles. I just liked fire in general, okay? There was part of that going on. But my parents also had these oil lamps, these glass oil lamps that they would light. And I was always surprised at how much light could come out of one single flame. And they would have it cranked way up and then you'd dial it back to the appropriate amount of light. And then we would all gather around the light and just enjoy it for a second. It was actually the very best thing about power going out, about our lights going out. We actually kind of liked it because we got to gather around the flame. And I remember actually there's even a slight amount of heat that comes out of that lamp over time. The glass gets hot and you kind of just gather around it and you enjoy it. It's like a mini campfire. We're drawn to it. We might not like to talk about the darkness, but we understand that light is meant to be elevated and we enjoy it. We might not always have the words for it, but we know the experience of it. And so I love it when Jesus looks at the people who are following him and he says, just as I am the light, you are the light. You are the light of the world. You are meant to be elevated so that people can see, not because you're better than anybody, but because you've spent time in the light. As Jesus continues on, he says in the same way, he drives us home, in the same way, let your light shine before others. Let your light shine before others. Why? That they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. I love that Jesus tells people that their good deeds are meant to be seen. I don't know where I picked it up from, but somewhere along the line, I started to believe that what I could do well or what was good in me is not meant to be noticed, but just meant to be kind of covert. And I think part of that might be maybe my own misreading at times of Jesus' commands. Jesus says, he said things like, when you fast, don't fast for your own glory. Don't fast for your own purpose to draw attention to yourself. When you give, don't let your right hand know what the left hand is doing. Jesus talked a lot about secrecy. So why now is Jesus telling people, put your good works on display? Doesn't that seem a little bit contradictory? Here's the difference. When Jesus talks about fasting, when he talks about giving, Jesus is pointing out people who were super religious in their society. And he said, did you see when they do it? They're doing it for a specific reason. They're not doing it to bless you. They're not doing it to bring light into your life. They're doing it so you can see how good they are. But when this collective city, when this lamp that's on a stand gives light to a room, something different happens. When our light is a simple reflection of Jesus' light in the world, something different happens. It doesn't bring glory to us, it brings glory to your Father who's in heaven. You see, we all, in a sense, become a communal witness to who Jesus is. To who Jesus is. That's what we're called to be. That's what it means to be a light. That's what it means to be a communal light. That's what it means to be a town on a hill or an elevated, purposeful, joy, hope-filled, giving light in the middle of a room. It means to be a witness of who Jesus is, a reflection of who he is. You know, a witness is an interesting thing. I don't follow court cases a whole lot, but what I do understand about them is sometimes evidence that's used in a crime or to make an accusation against somebody, sometimes those details can be pretty manipulated. And if you have a witness that's on the stand, a witness is somebody who has seen something happen, at least a certain aspect of it, and they're simply going to tell their story about what they saw, what they witnessed happening, and they share that. Now, one witness, that's a pretty significant thing. Two or more witnesses to the same thing, it becomes incredibly powerful. It becomes story-changing in those moments. Did those people have a hand in anything? Not necessarily. All they are doing is reflecting the story that they saw to somewhere else. Jesus is calling us to be a collective witness to who he is. Now, whether you know Jesus or not, here's the truth. Everyone, every single person, everyone lives as a witness to their faith, to their purpose, to who they are. Everyone lives as a witness to something. Now, you might sit here this morning and you might say, I don't feel like my life is a witness to what you're talking about. I don't believe my life is a witness to my faith or my purpose. I don't believe my life is a witness to anything. Here's what I would say, and here's what I would argue, and here's what I'm here to say today, is that your life is a witness to something. You might feel purposeless, you might feel bored, you might feel lost, or you might feel incredibly passionate about something. Your life is a witness to that thing, even if it's a witness to a lack. Even if it's a witness to an emptiness. I know plenty of people who have lived out a witness to the hurt and the bitterness that they've received at the hands of others. I've been that person. I'm ashamed to say it, but there was a time when I was a witness. I was living my life for almost a full year as a witness to somebody who had wronged me. Every chance I got, I was a witness. Every chance I got, I was upset and I was bitter, and when people asked about how I was doing, it was throwing somebody else under the bus. I'm sad to admit that. I'm sad to admit that even along the way, part of my witness was trying to bring that person down. And I've confessed it. I've dealt with it. It's not me anymore, but I was a witness to that. That was my purpose. It was an unarticulated, it was an unknown, it was an unthoughtful purpose, but it was my purpose. And I was living as a witness. Here's the thing, you are living as a witness to something. What are you living as a witness to? What is your life speaking about what you believe is true and good and right in this world? Maybe like me, you've become a witness to all that's wrong in the world. That can seem right and it can seem justice-filled, but I promise you, being a witness to only what's wrong in the world has never changed a life. Only light can push out the darkness. Darkness can't push out the darkness. You and I are called to be a witness, a communal, collective witness of the light of Jesus in the world around us. And I think we can all do that. There's a few things I want to give you that we can do to be this collective light. The first is to simply live in the light together. Live in the light together. In order to carry the light, we have to be in the light. And I'm talking about the light of Jesus. You may be able to identify other good and beautiful things in the world, but I want to make a claim that there is no better, brighter light than the light that's found in Jesus. It's a light that has an answer to every one of life's issues. I feel like we live in a world where we're not able to actually be honest. We're afraid to bring things into the light because of condemnation from all sides. It's not just from the religious, it's from the non-religious as well. It's all over the place. But what I see in Jesus is a woman who can be almost put to death at the hands of her accusers, and she can admit to affairs. And what Jesus says is, that's all right, I forgive you. Get up, don't stay down. Don't keep it in the dark, get up. I see Jesus meeting another woman at the well who had a string of affairs, and she brought it into the light, and he says, I know this. Now go get people and tell them I'm here. Jesus wasted very little time on people's mistakes. He forgave them and got them into the light. Here's the thing, if you are in a community where you feel like you can't bring the best and the worst of your life, you're not living in the light of Jesus. You're not in a community of light of Jesus. That's who we want to be. That's a word to all of us. It doesn't matter where you are. Be a light, be a community where we can live in the light of Jesus, where nothing is off limits, where we can share anything we need to be, and it's not a shaming context. It's a forgiving and a merciful context. It's a context where grace can be found, and grace isn't the same as mercy. Mercy and forgiveness, they bring us to 0. They clean the slate. Grace enables us to go to 100. That's what it means to live in the light. It means to be restored and to find your purpose among a group of people who are dedicated to living out the principles of what Jesus said. And if you forget who Jesus was, he's the one who offers forgiveness, yes, but he's also the one who heals and restores. He's the one who gives the sick back to their families. Some of my favorite stories in Scripture are when Jesus heals the leper, and it's not just a physical healing. We see the physical healing and it messes with our mind, but I think the more beautiful thing is the fact that the lepers were put outside of their families and outside of the city. They weren't allowed to talk or interact with anyone, and when Jesus heals them, they get their whole family back. It's a restoration. Jesus talked about forgiveness and reconciliation, not just between us and God, but between us and each other. This is what it means to live in the light. And the first step of being a city, the first step of being that elevated light is to live in the light. We need to be a people who are bringing all we are into the light, not hiding. You know, this is a sensitive topic, right? But there's not many kids in here. When you go by an adult sex shop, you very rarely see what's in it because of something around it. Right? Usually there's some kind of perimeter, there's some kind of barrier that keeps you from seeing in it. That's what it means to be hidden. There's things that we know that are in our lives that we don't want other people to see because we're afraid that if you saw the real me, you'd reject me. And Jesus says it's actually just the opposite in my family. That's shutting the lights off and saying, I'm just going to stay in the dark, and if I don't move, nobody will even see that I'm here. And Jesus says, no, bring the light in and let all of that be exposed to the light and it goes away. It's not just in the open, it's not just acknowledged, it's gone. I want to be in that light. Second thing that we need to do is not just live in the light, but we need to explain the light. We need to do more than just living in the light together. We have to be ready to explain the light. So last week I was in Portland. I was at my last ordination module. Praise the Lord. Okay? And I was checking into my hotel, and there's a whole string of us who are going into this module, checking into the hotel. And whenever I go up to a customer service person, they've usually had a long day. They usually get just a blank face. And I don't have the best face. It's the face I got, but I try to make it the best one I've got. And it's taken me a little time. I've tried to work up to a smile. I've gone from sneer to smirk and to somewhat of a smile now. And so when I go up to them, I just give them my best gentle smile. And I just stand and I just wait for them. And I try not to command anything. And so I get up to the desk, and I'm doing everything that I can to not smirk, but to have a genuine smile. And the woman behind the desk, she looks at me and she says, you have like this energy of joy around you. And I'm like, well, that's different. I'll take it. Usually I get, that's not a smile. I don't know what it is. You're just showing your teeth. I don't get it. But she said, there's something light around you. And I said, I honestly, I wish I could take credit for that, but I think what you're seeing is the light of Jesus in me. That's all that I can say, because I'm actually not, I'm just doing my best to smile. And if you got to do your best to smile and somebody says you're light, it's something else. I just got to tell you. You see, I think that if we spend time in the light, we're going to have to be ready to give an explanation for the light, because people are going to see something different. And it's in the way you and I live, and it's in the way we live collectively. When people see that, there's going to be a difference. And I'm not talking about shoving anything down somebody's throat. I'm talking about explaining what is different about the way you live. I'm not talking about judging somebody else. I'm talking about simply offering an explanation for what you've witnessed. It'd be pretty weird if somebody was put on stand and they said, listen, tell everybody here what you've seen. And the person on the stand just says, oh, I don't want to force anything on anybody, so I'm just going to keep that to myself. That'd be a bad witness. You and I are called to be witnesses. When we talk about evangelism is the process of sharing your faith in Jesus with other people and trying to get them to believe the same thing. There's a good place and a good time for that, but not all of us are evangelists, but every single one of us are called to be a witness. See, being a witness is about just being simply honest with what is true about your life. It's being honest and truthful about the things you've seen and the things you've experienced. I can be honest about the bad things I've done and that I've experienced and that have been done to me. And I can be just as honest about how I feel God has redeemed those things. That's witness. And it's best when we do it together. Not as a single light, but as a collective light. And finally, I think the best thing that we do together, not just living in the light, not just being ready to explain the light, but blessing others. Jesus calls these the good works, but I believe it's about blessing. When Janine and I, my wife, got here 3.5 years ago, when we moved here, one of the first things we started doing is having many. We didn't get everybody, but we opened our door in general to everybody. We had a lot of you that were here at the time into our house. And we started doing things together. We started trying to bless our neighborhood. We felt that if Jesus has called us to love our neighbors, that the best thing we can possibly do is actually love our neighbors. A radical thought, right? And so we wanted together to be able to bless others, and so we started throwing parties for our neighbors. And I remember one day I was out and I was setting up in our front yard. We had kind of communicated to our neighbors that we were going to have a party, and they looked different ways, but one of our neighbors came out, and when we were talking, and he said, I know you've invited me to these things before. I just want to let you know I appreciate it, but I'm so socially anxious. I'm never going to come to one of the parties. But I just got to know, why are you guys doing these? I was like, oh, I'd love to tell you, actually. And so I shared with him. I said, well, here's who we are. We are, most of us, followers of Jesus. And because we follow Jesus, we believe that he said to love our neighbor. And so that's just what we're trying to do. We're trying to love you guys well. He thought that was pretty cool. Now, at some level, he was working through what we were doing and wondering why we're doing it. And we were able to explain, and we were able to do a continual blessing of our neighborhood. Another one of our neighbors saw us doing these, and they were followers of Jesus. They moved out of our neighborhood since then, but I remember he came up to me and goes, I see what you're doing. And I agree. We just wanted to bless our neighborhood, and we could do that best together. When we threw a Thanksgiving dinner for our neighborhood, I couldn't do that very easily alone. We did it better together. When we got to celebrate one of our elderly neighbors' birthdays, because the year before we heard that nobody had done anything, it was just another day in his life, we threw a surprise party for him, a gentle surprise party. He was getting pretty old. Didn't want any adverse consequences there. But we called the neighborhood together and a couple of other friends, and we said, hey, let's throw him a party. Let's just bless him, because Jesus is a blessing. You see, we're blessed by the light that's around us, and we get to bless others, and we believe that in the end, the result is going to be people glorify God, not us. We get to explain that it's the Lord, and they will worship him in some way, shape, or form, or at the very least, if you don't know Jesus, I just want to make a bold claim, we want you to really question why we do what we do. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything, but I am going to say that we want to live in a way that actually makes you wrestle with what you believe. Because we think the best light is found around Jesus. And we have some work to do. We have some catching up to do. I think we have a picture I want to put up there. It's actually my favorite painting. I'm not a painting person, so by favorite I mean only painting that I like. But this is, many of you probably noticed, very popular, Starry Night from Van Gogh. You know, a whole lot's been done with this. But what I love about Van Gogh is he had a different significance to a lot of the colors that he would choose. And I don't remember all of them, but one I do remember is the yellow. Yellow represented divine. It represented divinity. And so you can see all the yellow that's throughout the painting. You can see it in the heavens. Now, what unfortunately got cut off in this picture is the city. But the city is full of light. Just like when you drive in to Yakima in the dark, you get to see everything lit up. But Van Gogh had an estranged relationship with the church. He was actually a missionary in the Catholic Church at one time, but he got kicked out because he was too extreme. He was renting the poorest housing he could to care for a group of coal miners. He was spending all of his extra money and couldn't afford nice clothes because he was spending it on their medicine, and he was tearing off his priestly robes to make binding, to bind their wounds while he was working alongside them in the mines. And the church said, that's not proper. That's not how priests work. Please stop. And he didn't make it through his trial period. But he got pretty good at some other stuff. And so as he's painting and he sees the divine, he sees it all over. He sees it in creation. He even sees it in the face of other people. But there's one building in this painting, if you could see the whole thing, that's not present, where it's not present. That's in the church. The only building in the entire painting that doesn't have divine light in it is the church. You see, this is how we're viewed. We are witnessing to something. And right now, church, followers of Jesus, if I'm going to get judgmental anywhere, it's with us, because we haven't done a good job. We've appeared as a people with no Jesus present. We've been being outdone by the goodness in others, which means we haven't been living in the light very well. I'm including myself in this when I say it. Do better. We can do better. We can. Let's go together. Let's be this kind of a community. Let's pray.